Michelle Graves, your host on today's segment of The Power of Money. I'm glad to have you here. Now, at The Power of Money, we are interested in three things happening. First, we want you to get the necessary education so that you and your family can make the decisions that will impact positively on you in your financial life. The second thing is that you be empowered to prosper. I only want the best for you. And you can only get that if you have education and then the drive to make it happen. And the third thing that is so important to me is that you recognize that life is more than a journey, and that you be energized so that you can begin to participate in the truly joyous experience of living. So, here's to empowerment, here's to education, and here's to energy. I'm Michelle Graves, your host, Power of Money, and here we go. And here we go today on today's segment of The Power of Money. I'm honored and delighted as always to be in your world for the next hour. And as always on The Power of Money, and we've been doing this show out of this particular office for almost 8 years, and The Power of Money since 1982. So I'm not really new to television, for those of you that are newly involved, but my focus has never changed or deviated over the years. I'm committed to bringing you just the very best of information, the best people that I can get to talk about a specific subject, and today's show is no different. Today's show is a very unusual show, in as much as we are now in the midst of just everything. I'm not kidding you. COVID-19 is just globally off the chart. No shifting in place. People's lives have been completely turned upside down. Most of you are probably experiencing that. In the middle of this, we are in the midst of an economic fallout for our country because of the inability of people to work and to make a livelihood, which has a direct impact on spending. And in a capitalist country, without spending, you have problems. And then in the midst of the economic collapse and the economic chaos and the COVID and all those things, we have Black Lives Matter. And that was erupted. Actually, it's always been there, but it erupted full face with the death of Mr. Floyd at the hands of the police, and it's just never stopped. And so today, my guest is, in my opinion, and I say this very openly, one of the most forward-thinking individuals that I have had occasion to talk to and meet, and I had to have her on my show. Her name is Dr. Marcy Paul, PhD. She is the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Montgomery County, Ohio. Her background is exhaustive and extensive, 30 years in this particular field, and I felt that she would be the ideal person. First, because she is a woman, yes, a female. And secondly, because she too is a minority. She's a Jew. And God knows they have had a long history, globally, of being abused, maligned, condemned, killed, executed, and I can go on and on and on, forced conversion to Christianity, on and on and on and on. Therefore, I wanted to get her perspective about this entire issue of racism, and as a Jewish woman who is in a position to impact on policy, I wanted her on my set. So please have a seat. Some of you may very well be enlightened. Some of you may not be able to stomach it. But stomach it you will have to, because things are on that path now. Things are not going back. Really, that's over. And as I've shared with you over the years, how you handle change is going to have a lot to do with how you get through this next cycle called life. Because the world is changing. It is unacceptable for us to have environmental issues. As brilliant as humanity is, we should be solution oriented so that we can all live. It's unacceptable to have children who are abused and maligned and hungry all over the world. It is so unacceptable on so many levels to cut off people because God made them a certain race or they came out of a certain... That is bizarre behavior. That's just totally bizarre. And so that's my opinion. You may not agree with me, but thank God we're in America, and it's perfectly acceptable for you not to agree with me, but the logic of what I'm telling you is truthful. So I'm going to begin this interview, and prayerfully we can get through a lot, but if not, I'm going to have her back because Black lives do matter. Yes, all lives matter, but right now the focus is on 450 years of Black lives not mattering. And let's talk about that. How are you today?
I'm a little overwhelmed by your introduction. Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here. I just moved to Dayton, and so I'm excited to participate and talk with you about these issues.
Well, I found your perspective so profoundly refreshing that I could be open, because the subject of racism is almost as bad as sexism. There are blinders. People don't want to talk about it. They get fratsy and scratching and all kinds of subliminal behaviors when you bring up the subject of race.
But who gets uncomfortable? I think that's the key. Who gets uncomfortable talking about race and racism? And it's usually white people, correct? It's usually people who have lived a certain life and they don't want to deal with anything that's uncomfortable, anything that they have to self-reflect on.
What's bad about self-reflection?
Oh, I think self-reflection is the key, and lifelong learning. And in fact, when I moved to Dayton to take this position as a retired academic at university, I came in with the idea that we were going to address cultural humility.
And cultural humility.
Yes, cultural humility, which is not cultural competency. It is not tolerating others.
Mm-hmm.
It is about humility. And the first principle of cultural humility is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And this was a term coined by a medical doctor and a PhD in nursing, Jan Murray Garcia and Melanie Turvalon in California. And it was based in the medical profession.
Okay.
That when we are speaking to patients, when we are speaking or working in a clinical setting, how we interact with a patient, we have to understand that they may not be culturally the same. Their needs may be different. If a woman is screaming because that's what she does after childbirth, we don't assume she is bad. We find out that maybe in a certain culture, that's part of what they do.
That is so profound what you said, cultural humility, which is a respect for how other cultures behave.
Yes.
No judging, just understanding that this is a part of their life experience on so many levels.
On so many levels, and just a very key question. What do you need? What can I learn about you?
But there has to be a willingness to acknowledge that you need to learn about someone else and their world. There has to be that acknowledgement. I had that experience living overseas and dealing with all kinds of people. You have to dumb it down. That American hero stuff does not work in other cultures. And I know it sounds odd, I'm an African American female, but the reality is that we have a certain culture over here. Mm-hmm. We do. And it does not necessarily translate well in other cultures. It comes across as presumptuous in many cases, arrogant, mm-hmm. all-knowing, and that doesn't go well. So let's talk more about this cultural humility, because now you've really got me interested. No, this is very good stuff.
Yeah, and it's not used because it's, I don't want to say it's dismissed, but you have to work at it. You don't get a certificate at the end of a training. You don't get this idea that, okay, I'm now culturally competent. And right. It's also not, when I think about, am I going to tolerate you now because I am working on tolerance? Who am I right. and who are you that we can tolerate each other? But cultural humility really talks about empathy. It talks about, and it highlights that we all have a culture.
And that culture should be respected.
Right.
Not opinionated.
Right.
But respected.
And that we can, if we respect it and we are learning, then we find shared meaning in our lives.
Yes.
And those shared meanings make us understand and realize that we have more in common or something in common than we don't have in common. And then it also affords us the ability to learn about our differences.
And be okay with it.
And be okay with it.
That is what I always felt in our culture in the United States of America, which is shared differences. It's perfectly okay for you as a Jewish woman to honor Shabbat, mm-hmm. which viewers is all over the world, Jews and people that ascribe to their God, which I do. 6 o'clock on Fridays is shutdown time. It's Sabbath, Shabbat. And if you don't understand what that looks like, you would be like, what is this all about? Well, it's about a historical mandate by their God to shut down and to devote that time to rest, to family, to worship, to celebration without labor. So I bring that up because that's very important if you're going to reach out and understand how things are different. In the same way, in the African American community, we have very defined cultural differences in how we talk to each other. We tend to, in many cases, to be loud and boisterous and off the grid in many cases. That doesn't take away from who we are. It's just a part of our culture. Is that a fair statement?
That's an interesting statement. On the one hand, I want to say, yes, I agree.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I don't want to essentialize.
Okay.
Right? And so too often, and I've seen this over and over again, professors in a classroom who say, could you speak?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell us about the Black experience?
Okay. From my perspective.
From your perspective. Only. But the assumption is that you can speak it for all.
Oh no. Yeah.
Well, and the same thing has happened for me as a Jewish person. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what Jewish people think about this issue? Yeah. But it doesn't happen so much with white Christians.
Now that is the ultimate irony.
Well, and I'll give you an example.
Give me an example.
So in the classroom, or I used to facilitate dialogues on racial justice and social justice. And the first thing I do is I go around the room and I ask about people's culture. Tell me something about your culture. And I'm generalizing, and I know this is broadcasting and all of that. I'm generalizing here, and I don't have the data and the statistics here to back me up. So
Okay.
I'm saying that as a
Okay,
caveat.
carefully. Okay.
Yes. When I go around the room, everybody can say something, and they do, and they, you know, whether it's food related or whatever it is. When it comes to white European Christians, they say, I don't have a culture.
They say they don't have they been homogenized
Well,
into something?
But that's and it, I feel bad. On my mic, I feel bad for that, because yes, you do have a culture.
Yes.
Of course you have a culture. It may be a family culture. It may be a religious culture.
Right.
Everybody has culture. But because of homogenization and because of the cultural norms of this society, the norm is them. And anything other than the norm is marginalized.
So, given that specific group, how in the world, if they don't believe that they have a unique cultural expression, how do they handle dialogue with other groups?
Well, that's a great question.
I just, inquiring minds want to
Inquire-
know if
And
you
again,
think you're it.
I don't want to
Where do we go?
essentialize.
We don't have to, but it is a question that does merit some kind of an answer.
It's not easy, and that's
My
the key
goodness.
with cultural humility. And you talked about it in your introduction: education, travel, you know, going places, meeting new people, putting yourself out there is such an educational experience, and it opens your mind to so many different ways in
does.
which people walk in the world. And that's why we talk about white privilege, and we talk about white fragility, and it's not easy. And
So what is white privilege?
so white privilege is it's wow, you're putting me on the spot here.
Oh, no,
So
just-
no, I know. So let me give you an example,
Okay,
and we'll start that way.
okay.
I need a Band-Aid. You and I are going out to one of the pharmacies to get Band-Aids. I
Okay.
need a Band-Aid.
Okay.
And so I go pick my Band-Aid, and one says nude. And you look at it and go, that's not my nude,
Right,
right?
right.
And so we can have Band-Aids with Hello Kitty and lime and pink and all these different colors. But why don't we have Band-Aids that are shades of brown and black? That's white privilege. So when we do not acknowledge or understand that there are more in our world, in this society, that are not white, that's white privilege. It's unearned privilege. It's privilege based on just the color of our
Your
skin. I can get through the door. And I moved here from Texas.
Oh my goodness.
I can get through the door, but
Yeah.
once I'm in the door and people know I'm Jewish,
Oh, it's-
then I become marginalized. And again, I'm generalizing here.
Yes.
But I've done these studies over and over again, and I've seen it work, and I've seen how it plays out. I'll give you an example. So I was doing a dialogue for racial justice with a police department.
Okay.
And the chief of police decided that he wanted to start these dialogues, which ran for 4 weeks, and more of the work was being done in between the weeks because we were given a topic and thought about it, read about it, watched TV, whatever it had to be. They had homework to do. And then the next week we would do more talking about what we
Okay.
saw or read. The chief of police decided that we were going to start these dialogues at the top
Okay.
in the administration.
Okay. That's
and
a
work
good
our
place.
way
Okay.
down, because
All right.
too often it's the people at the bottom that need the work, while the top doesn't engage. And he told a story. This is a gentleman who has a PhD. He's chief of police. His wife sends him to a store at 11 o'clock at night to get a gallon of milk. He's in his sweats and a sweatshirt. And he gets out of his car, which happens to be a Lexus. Excuse me. And he hears doors locking next to him.
Oh, no.
He's an African American, chief of police,
PhD.
That's part of the problem. And white privilege, as we're seeing right now, is this idea of unearned privilege just based on the color of your skin. Here is a man with a lot of privilege, and he isn't granted any just because of the color of his skin.
That is so real. Let me share with you something that I have not talked about, but I'll say it as a part of a general transformation that I've been going through. One of them being my hair, which many people are not aware, white women are not aware that their standard of beauty is emulated in our community. This goes back with the processed hair, straight hair, very American Girl kind of presentment, as you can see there on my banner. But the reality is, for white women and women that have very straight hair naturally, is that for African descent women to have that appearance, they have to use sodium hydroxide, which is known as lye, which they've now determined causes brain cancer in African American women. Well, that's information that is needed for not only our women, but also for our sisters, white women, that you are going to have to recognize that the whole system was based upon a standard of beauty that fits you, does not fit me. And so, because I'm not interested in leaving Earth with brain cancer because of sodium hydroxide, which is also what weaves. They use a glue that has sodium hydroxide. Oh yeah, that's how you get all that fake hair glued in. But as I tell people, but why do you want to engage in that? And then I've had my white girlfriends are like, gosh, that's kind of radical. I'm like, no, what is radical is that it took me so long to recognize that that was systemic, that we do not have to embrace your standards of beauty that are part of your culture. And that is a culture that says you have to be straight hair, blonde, and that we cannot just do what we do. I wash my hair and this is what happens. Zoop. And I'm fine with it. It's freed me up from bills and wigs and everything. So, but that is an example. And then the second thing I want to bring up that happened to me that was an awakening was I was going to Nashville, Tennessee, driving. It was late at night, and I was stopped by the police for no reason. They blocked me in. And at that time, the gentleman that was with me, I was driving, he just went stone. He just froze. Older guy. I get out the car, because they tell me to get out the car with my hands up. What the heck had I done? I'm trying to figure it out. And it occurred to me that they just did it because they could. And they ultimately released me because there was no reason to keep me. And they wanted to know, well, why are you out here this late? Well, sir, I'm out here driving, trying to get to a destination, and I had not even thought about the time.
And why should you?
Why would I think about the time?
Are you over 18?
I was like, like a aha moment. This happened to me maybe 6 years ago. And it really put me on a very different path in terms of looking at things and the awareness that I had as a child in Kentucky with extreme segregation and stuff, and to find myself at my age still dealing with this thing, which is not unique to me. It's very common for so many of our people. It's like, can I get away from this?
Well, and I think about young black boys.
Oh my gosh.
Who are taught from a very young age, because they see it happen, that when they get into a car, their dad or some male figure puts a wallet on the dashboard.
Right.
Because you are taught never to, if you get stopped,
no moves.
Don't move.
Right.
Did I ever teach that to my son? Absolutely not.
Right.
Didn't even think that I had to teach that to my son.
Right.
And those are the microaggressions that become macro, that they eat away at you. They cut at your soul. They cut at your physicalness, your physicality, your emotions.
Right.
Never being able to just put on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and go shopping.
Go shopping.
Always had to dress up, right?
Right. Always.
Always.
I mean, always. Absolutely.
And people don't understand it who haven't lived it.
Right.
And so,
because you want to be perceived as non-threatening. When you go into a shopping mall, which I love online, I'm done with all that, because you don't want to get into any trouble, because trouble for people of color has a whole different spin.
right.
Having to go into the jail system, and you can't post bond, and then you sit there and you sit there. And this is a very real part of that type of a living that white people in this country seldom encounter.
And I'll share a story with you that I think for me was life-changing as well. I've been growing up in a Jewish home.
Yes.
In a Reform Jewish home.
Okay.
Which is the progressive liberal end of it.
Yeah.
We are taught from an early age to question. We are also taught tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. So we've always been very involved in social justice.
Right.
And so this is part of my DNA. My grandfather growing up, he and I would drive around Chicago, and he would show me the political places where Emma Goldman, the revolutionary woman from the 1800s, would have her protests. And so this is in my DNA. This isn't something I learned in school. But something happened in the early 90s. I was working. I was working at a university, and I was also the chair of the Women's Commission, the Mayor's Women's Commission for the city of Fort Worth, Texas.
Okay.
And we decided to do a program on infant mortality. Infant mortality, babies that die before their first birthday. African American women lose their babies at twice the rate as white American women.
My
Educated, college-educated African American women lose their babies at twice the rate as white American women who have not graduated from high school. And I was so, it was a strange moment for me, because I had lost a baby.
Okay.
And as I started to talk to people, and African American women, and I started to do the research, and I started to work in that area, which ultimately I was brought over to a school of public health to teach about this.
Okay.
When my son was born with a heart problem, he was taken from the hospital where he was born to Dallas, to the Children's Hospital. And I received calls from the insurance company saying everything's covered. We don't want you to worry. We want you to get well. I had a C-section. And then I started to hear the stories from Black women. And the premature birth and the lack of access to quality health care. And this has been a problem, and a huge problem in a lot of communities, Dayton as well, and over years and years. And in fact, in my research, it was I think 1898, it was mentioned in a newsletter, the Catholic Black Women's Newsletter. I don't remember exactly because I'm old, but about infant mortality and the disparities and inequities of Black babies dying at a higher rate than white babies. And I immersed myself in this area of research.
Okay, tell me more.
And what I want to say about it comes back to the cultural humility piece. The assumption that when a woman doesn't show up to her appointment on time and she's told, well, we can't take you now, you're late.
Yep.
Without asking
why.
Well, maybe I had to take the bus. Maybe I have to work and it's hard for me. I'm working an hourly job. Whatever it is, those questions are not asked. Access to quality health care. Well, where do I live? Where do I have to live? What's available to me? Those are all questions that talk about the difference of white privilege and no privilege.
Right.
And health inequities. Now all of a sudden with COVID-19, which we are seeing,
yes.
Now all of a sudden it's a big issue. And it should be. I'm not saying it shouldn't be. It should be. But there are so many indications of other issues, health-related issues, maternal mortality. Black women are dying after giving birth at 2 times plus the rate of white American women. Why? It's not genetic. Until we deal with it as an issue of institutional racism and look at the foundation of these issues, it's not necessarily that you're not getting health care, you're not getting prenatal care. Why?
Right.
Why?
The why question.
The why question, which is why I do qualitative research, because I want to know the why. And then with the why comes how do we change the system? And that's the other part of cultural humility is accountability.
Right.
Accountability
Right.
for what the institution looks like, right?
Yes.
And an example of that is one of the major stores in this country years ago, maybe 10 years ago, had a doll on the shelf, and it was around the Christmas holidays. It was a black baby in a monkey suit, holding a banana.
Great.
So there were complaints, and I show these examples to my students because unless you're showing real examples,
They don't believe you.
They don't believe
Right,
you,
they don't
or
believe-
to these groups that I worked with. So you start to unpack these issues, and then you say, well, who's in the corporate office?
Right.
Well, if the corporate office does not represent the community, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
I don't call it ignorance at first. I call it a lack of information.
Okay.
It quickly can become ignorance, right?
Right. Very quickly.
Very quickly. But just that one little example, like the Band-Aid.
Yes. Which, by the way, when you brought that up, there was a gentleman maybe 23 years ago, and I owned my own consulting company at that time, he and his wife came to me. He was a scientist, and he actually had created tonality in Band-Aids. He did. And do you not know that he was summarily crushed, and I will not name the names, but the largest Band-Aid maker in the country made sure that he could not go to market with his colors. They were not willing to offer these tonalities, but they were not willing to allow him to do what they weren't willing to do.
And they weren't willing to do it because we wrote a letter to a large company.
Yes, name withheld. Yeah,
right.
Name withheld.
But through one of my groups,
Yes.
because I'm also about action.
Yes.
What are we going to do? We've
Right.
learned together.
Okay.
We've studied together. What are we going to do as action? So we wrote a letter. And the letter we got back was, we don't have a market.
We don't.
And now all of a sudden,
Do you not know?
they're coming out.
They're
with them.
coming out. 25. This was real life to me because I could not believe they actually sued this man. He was just a fledgling entrepreneur, a scientist who had done his market research, had a business plan, had all the things, but they denied him entry into the market. Period. They overwhelmed him with legal activity, which they could do, and he could not. And rather than pursue it, he just dropped it.
And power plus privilege
Oh.
equals institutional racism.
Power plus privilege equals institutional racism. That is so something.
And I want to share one last example
Okay.
regarding the Band-Aid.
Okay.
So I was giving a guest lecture in a political science class at a university, and I used to have this big cardboard with all the Band-Aids.
Okay.
And when I asked about why we don't have a black Band-Aid or shades of brown, or I like that tonality.
Tonality, yeah.
One student, and I'm not going to even tell you what he looked like,
It doesn't even matter.
said, he raised his hand and he said, we can't have a black Band-Aid because the dye would get into our skin and the dye color costs more.
He made that statement.
Yes.
That's extreme rationalization.
And I can back that up with someone else hearing it.
And he was very,
And
very real about that,
He
I'm
was
sure.
real. He was real.
Huh. Black dye versus pink dye. That's interesting. The tattoo market would never survive with that analysis. But it
But he
does. But
rationalized.
the rationalization of the perverse. This is where my mind begins to think. How do you rationalize the perverse, the irrational, the bizarre? How do you
He
rationalize
doesn't
it?
have to rationalize it because he has the privilege.
And he can
And
call
that's
it.
white privilege.
You know what, Dr. Marcy? This is going to be a long road. This is going to be a long road. It is. Because that type of institutional behavior that is so part of the American culture, as I said, my white girlfriends commenting on my hair and having to tell them, are you not aware that we put lye in our hair to emulate you? And why? And they're like, what? Well, I didn't know. And again,
And they're your girlfriend.
and they're my girlfriends. And I was just like, I just need to hit you. Just stop it. You're making me mad. But it's going to be really, really a long journey. It's going to be a long
It
road.
has been a long journey.
Yes.
And here's one thing I want to share with you. And I wish I had asked her permission to say who she was beforehand. A few weeks ago, I was having lunch with someone, a new friend.
Okay.
And she said to me, Jewish people are taught never to forget
Correct.
the Holocaust.
Correct.
And we, speaking of herself, as a black woman, she said, we are taught shame and to forget.
Slavery didn't happen.
Right.
Like that.
And she said to me, look at me. I'm a survivor of slavery. Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
We need to work together. Yes, we have differences.
Correct.
We need the police at our Shabbat service at our synagogues, and to help us.
Yeah.
I mean, there are differences, and nobody is saying there are not.
Right.
We have overcome some of the things because of our white skin. It's also created more trauma for us.
I
right?
have to believe it does.
Yes. We don't own the banks or the media or all that.
Right.
But the alliance that we could have, just as we had, no, not just as, but different than during the civil rights movement.
Right.
With Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., they were like brothers.
Yes.
We need a new alliance. We need a new alliance that doesn't look like it did, because we need something different. Things have changed. We need it organic.
Yes.
We need to build relationships just like this.
Right.
From when we first met.
Right. I just loved you. I did.
Well, and I loved you too. And we
did.
We didn't just talk about business.
No.
We talked about family and life.
Right.
That's what we need to do.
Right.
And we need to include our brown sisters and brothers.
We do. When I lived in China for that period of time, I saw so much 15 years ago. I saw so much about a culture that was so alien and unlike America. But I will tell you that among the women, there was immediate, I cannot explain to you, there was immediate connection. Immediate. Click, click. We talked about our children. They talked about the challenges of not having, they couldn't have children. They were limited to one child, and what happened when you got pregnant, where the whole culture of fear from getting pregnant by your husband. And oh my gosh, if it was a girl, that was definitely an abortion. And look at them today. They've got all these men and no women.
And no women.
Young, vibrant men. So again, it caused me to look at their situation, their needs, their desires, and the level of violence those women experience against, again, their husbands are very harsh. And so it made me recognize, and then of course dealing with women in Africa, it made me recognize that there is a commonality here. There's a commonality here. We birth children, we bring life.
Or we choose not to.
Or we choose not to.
We have that option.
Right, we do.
Just because we're women doesn't mean that we're mothers.
Well, given the census data that's just come out, we're definitely choosing not to be mothers, because the fertility rates have plummeted in this country. Women are not having children.
Right.
The lesser developed countries of Africa are exploding. Nigeria is going to surpass us because they are having children, whereas Europe and the United States are not.
Right.
They're not having children. Now, I don't know the data on African American women as far as childbirth and that whole scenario. I don't know.
I can't pull that out of my brain right now. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But it's still higher than white American women.
Yeah.
That I know, but I don't have the stats in my head that I can just.
But they're making those choices.
They're making those choices, and again, those choices come with some burden as well, because some of those choices are not choices that are easily, they're not made out of self-desire. Sometimes they're choices made out of what's available.
Right.
And what do they know? And what do I know? And the norm of society goes back to talking about your hair.
Right.
The norm of our society is not your beautiful natural hair.
Yeah.
And until we take those moments back,
right,
then maybe the norming changes. I don't know.
I don't have any answers, because I actually thought by the time I reached my age, I'm not kidding you, Doctor.
Oh,
I just didn't. I mean, come on. I'm looking at 70. Jeez. And we are still running around like rats in a cage, trying to find out something that I know God in his infinite wisdom is saying, you guys are nuts. you got the same DNA configurations.
Right.
Period. Your blood types tell the story, and you are still behaving in a horrible way. Animals don't behave like this. Bugs don't behave like this. But you all are busily eating each other for dinner.
Well, and if you look at the history of how that all happened, it's one person deciding on categories of identity.
Yes.
And Friedrich Blumenbach in the 1800s was a botanist, and he looked at different flowers and identified. And then all of a sudden the mountains became the identifying factor of people. Mm-hmm. Race is a construct. It's a construct. It's not biological. It is a social construct that we define, and we meaning the norms of society. And even within race, the darker the skin, the lighter the skin.
Right.
All of that is constructed.
Does not have a foundation.
It does not have any biological foundation, just as gender. Sex is biological if you're born a girl or a boy, but gender is a construction. Female, male, what does it mean?
One has
and the gender
a womb.
Fluidity now
Right.
allows people to be who they want to be.
Which is exciting to me. That is a great leap forward, that people can be what works for them.
Right.
Without being boxed into a definition of what they should be.
And placed into categories.
Ah!
This is what I find fascinating. I'm placing you into a category, not for you, but for me. It makes me feel better about myself, because now I've placed you, and I've placed you and you and you, and maybe there's some similarities, but as long as it is a brain working thing, that it makes life easier. Oh, well, that's them.
But does it?
For some it
Question.
does. For some it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because once you have identified a characteristic that fits comfortably into your little box of stereotypes, then you can go forward feeling okay.
Right.
I pray, Dr. Marcy, I pray that when it's all said and done, that we can look at our commonalities rather than our differences, and that we can be patient with the process. Because to be candid with you, to be a white person in America right now with a certain mindset is very, very unsettling. Very, because I don't understand where that came from. Did it come from your parents? Your parents, your grandparents crazy? Where did this stuff come from? And where can we offer, or what can we offer this generation that's emerging? I've got a grandchild who I love, and grandchildren behind him who I love, and I don't teach them that. And when we encounter it in public, my comment to them is that they are of lesser intelligence. I tell them, well, God didn't make everybody smart. So he says, well, that means he's not smart. Exactly. That means he doesn't have the ability to comprehend. Okay, and we can go with that, but I don't know how long that will work. You see what I'm saying?
I do, because I have a 21-year-old, and and in some ways he's so far ahead of me, but in other ways, having grown up where he grew up and where I grew up,
right,
completely different worlds. And so, it's a hard one. It's
Oh,
a hard one.
but it's one that we have to pursue.
Absolutely.
I
And it's
will not
exciting.
get- it is.
It's exciting. And if we spend the time looking for those common threads,
Right.
instead of talking about racism and sexism and all the isms,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we can grow from that.
Right. And I think you're correct, because I can't find any other area to begin this transition. I mean, we can continue to protest. I believe that there's a level of white consciousness that has evolved under the Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness, they started Googling, they started reading stuff. My PhD work, which was at that time, didn't complete, the economics of slavery. 40 years ago, that was not a subject matter that people wanted to talk about. So when I would share the things that happened to my people that were so horrific and so brutal, nobody wanted to hear that. It's like, oh my God, you know, artichokes at the dinner table? No. So it backed me off. But of late, I have been releasing information, and I have been talking to people about the deep DNA impact of slavery, that it caused mutations in our DNA that are now generational. The fear, all of that is real.
And DNA, and also social and
Yes.
cultural.
Yes.
Why do Black women not breastfeed? And I'm generally speaking. And, you know, it's a big issue.
Yes,
it has
it
been a
is.
big issue. Oh, because they, you know, don't want to, blah, blah, blah. No, it's because grandma told me not to do it. And I listened to
Right.
grandma over the doctor.
Right.
And grandma may not even know why, but it goes
Right.
back to slavery.
It does.
And wet nursing the
Right.
the white baby.
Right.
But unless we know, unless we educate, unless we learn from each other, we don't know this.
I tell you, information and education is powerful. And I believe in these concluding moments, for this has been a phenomenal interview. Let me just say this as a side. I appreciate your brilliance and your intellect and your understanding of an area of science that is not even respected. But it is going to change, because we will not get to the finish line without people like yourself, who are willing to engage in, as our now deceased John Lewis said, oh yes, good trouble.
Good trouble.
Good trouble, where no, we're not signing off on that. That's old school. We don't do that anymore. I thank you so much for coming on the station.
you.
I thank you for being a part of my world and my viewers' world. I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure this broadcast goes live everywhere, because what you bring to the table is essential right now. Our young people have the fight and they have the passion, but that has to be balanced with wisdom and knowledge. It's too important. We as a nation, we are at a tipping point on so many things, and this is one of them. So, concluding today's show on the power of money, I'm your host, Michelle Graves. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today on racism from a Jewish woman's perspective. She's amazing. I'll see you next time. You take care. God bless. Bye-bye.